Welcome. Today I wanted to discuss the historical accuracies of Anatomy by Dana Schwartz, which I recently finished reading. Anatomy takes place in around the late 1700s, really early 1800s, I think 1817. And it takes place in Edinburgh, Scotland. The main character is a woman who is studying to become a surgeon. That's not necessarily accurate in the sense that women weren't allowed to be surgeons at this time, but that's a whole part of the plot. What I wanted to discuss today were some of the things surrounding anatomy, the history that is used in the book to make it such an interesting plot, because I think that it's just a really fucking fun plot, and it's a fun part of history to learn about. I'm sorry, I had to cut out to fix the lights. Resurrection men play a large role in the plot of this book, and resurrection men are some of my favorite things to learn about historically. In the United Kingdom, when modern medicine was being developed, and the Anatomy Act, which took place in 1832, there was this desperate need for corpses. And this need for corpses was really founded. So biologists and physicians needed the corpses in order to learn about the human body, dissect it, study it. I mean, even today, with everything that we have regarding modern science, regarding technology, biologists and people studying pre-med still use cadavers in order to do their work. So the resurrection men sort of filled a need in the society, but it was a very illegal need. Before the Anatomy Act was placed, it was illegal to dissect a body unless it was one of the state-sanctioned cadavers. So these state-sanctioned cadavers were almost always criminals, people who had been put to death, who were considered too horrible for burial, and then were donated to a certain university or lab. And it was kind of this weird wait list cycle where you weren't sure who the body was going to go to. One of the issues was, in the rise of the 19th century, we have a huge influx of people who want to study to be physicians. We also have, at the same time, we have a decrease of capital punishment cases. So less people were being put to death by the government, which meant that there were less bodies to dissect. And there was a larger, consistently growing need for more bodies. So the resurrection men come in. These people were not the creme de la creme of society. These people were a part of a wonderful, shady underbelly that ran most large cities. And their job was really simple. It was to exhume bodies and give them to whoever paid them to exhume the body. And you could ask for requests. So you could be I really want a body with smallpox. I really want a woman with a limp. You could get the world was your oyster with the resurrection men. What they would do is they would post up at wakes, obituaries, churches, and try to find people, and they had informants too, try to find people who were dying. And then they would wait for the funeral. After the funeral, the body's been exhumed, they would sneak into the graveyard, dig up the body, and then leave. Now, this doesn't sound particularly elaborate, but once people started catching on, they got kind of pissed. See, there's an ethical reason why people didn't want their loved ones to be exhumed. I mean, one, that's kind of shady, but also during this time, most of these areas were pretty religious, and their ideology was, how are you supposed to get to heaven if your body's being dissected? You need to be preserved for the rapture, so I don't want this to happen. So they started doing these really elaborate things in order to combat the resurrection men before that they could exhume somebody's body. They would do things like put concrete slabs over top of a coffin so that the resurrection men couldn't get through it. They would post somebody by the grave for a couple of nights so that the body would have time to decompose enough that the resurrection men wouldn't want to grab it. They would even put like elaborate metal cages on top of the tombs so that like you couldn't dig down right underneath there. Of course, the resurrection men like combated this in their own way. They would like dig like a couple hundred yards away from the grave. If there was like a slab or some sort of thing, or even a person posted, they would dig a couple hundred yards from the grave and just kind of like burrow down and then open the person's casket from like underground, whip them out and then be gone in the night. One of the like super fun things about this is that once they have transported the bodies out of the graveyard, they need to transport them to universities and hospitals, which usually are in pretty populous areas. So there's some really funny like documented stories of like, you know, people taking dead bodies on public transit and just pretending that it's like their drunk friend. Like it gets really elaborate. And I think that, you know, this is one of the things that I love about this, about the resurrection men at large, is that it's just fucking funny. It's a fucking funny situation in the most gallows humor way. And I dig that so much. But Anatomy focuses on these characters, focuses on this career, if you will, and does it pretty accurately. So Schwartz describes what Jack would need to do in order to grab a body, the different lookouts, how, you know, people get information about dead people, all that jazz. And it's fucking wonderful because honestly, why don't we have more romances starring resurrection men? They're great. One of the other interesting things that Anatomy discusses is something that Schwartz has titled Roman fever. And Roman fever is described in the book as something which produces like big blisters on someone's back, which pop and are really bloody. I could not for the life of me find anything that was historically tied what was titled the Roman fever with symptoms like this. So what Roman fever in actuality was a very specific strain of malaria, which is believed to have assisted in the fall of the Roman Empire during the 5th century AD. So a little bit off historically and time period wise. What's really funny is that malaria behaves very much like a very severe flu. I mean, you can die from it and you can get a stroke and die, so it's not to be scoffed at, but it doesn't have these kind of like Black Plague-esque boils that like create this horrifying scene. This is a very gothic trope in my mind that Schwartz has essentially created a false illness in order to like perpetuate the plot along, because like people dying of malaria isn't nearly as exciting as people dying of boils on your back. I think it's also really funny that the illness is made up because Dr. Beecham, the antagonist in the book, uses the Roman fever to cover up some of the people he's been killing. So I just think it's funny because all of it's fake. No one is dying from Roman fever, although in the book they hearken to the idea that people have. Talking about Dr. Beecham, and this makes absolute sense. Dr. Beecham was not a historical figure. As far as I can tell, he is absolutely fictitious, which is probably for the best because not that there aren't historical doctors that I would be happy slandering, but it would kind of hurt the rep, you know? But it did lead me down the rabbit hole of questioning who actually invented local anesthetic. So in this book, in 1817-ish, Dr. Beecham is the character who invents a like glowing blue serum that works pretty much like a local anesthetic or just anesthesia, period. So he gives orally this glowing liquid and the patients that he's working on immediately pass out. So the history of local anesthetic, it turns out, is rife with drugs. I don't know why I didn't think that, but I didn't really think about it. The first time that the idea of anesthesia was found by white people, was when white people came to the Peruvian Andes, and the Peruvians in that area were using the cacao plant to make people feel better, essentially. So it worked as a little bit of an anesthesia, kind of like giving someone like whiskey or something. And it seemed to help with the process. So they ended up taking the cocoa plant and turning it into cocaine. I'm not kidding. And they used cocaine as anesthesia for a long time. And they would make different topical tonics to put on a person so that an area would be numbed and then they would be able to work on it. One of famous people who used anesthesia at this time, this is much later in the 1800s, would be Sigmund Freud. He literally just took cocaine orally, mixed like a 4% cocaine mixed with water, and he would use this to reach a different state of being. But for the most part, it was really not until the early 1900s when we see cocaine being used in a productive enough and effective enough way that it can be titled a specific anesthetic. So these anesthetics are called Stovane and Procrane, and they are the things that have come out, the things that came out of cocaine as an anesthetic and were actually the first localized anesthetics. So what's really interesting about this is that it would have been, during the time of anatomy's writing, it would have absolutely been mind-blowingly informative to have something that could literally take away a patient's pain during surgery. Would be chef's kiss. I think that that's something that's super important for people to know, is that for the majority of history, surgeries were done without any anesthetic whatsoever. The patient was oftentimes awake, or passed out by themselves. Obviously, this makes the process so much more dangerous. It prevents surgeons from being able to do more intricate surgeries. I mean, anesthetics just good all the way around. Listen, nobody wants someone screaming on the table, and nobody wants to be screaming on the table, you know? But let's look into female doctors, because obviously the main character of this book is not a real person. Hazel Sinnott never existed. However, I did want to mention some baller female physicians because they're queens. The first woman to graduate with a medical degree was Elizabeth Blackwell, and Elizabeth Blackwell graduated with her degree in 1847. And she actually had to, so she was English by birth. She moved to America to get this degree because, according to history at that time, America was above and beyond where England was with women going to school. So holler at that. It is important to note, though, and I want to end on this. It's important to note that despite the fact that the first woman to get a medical degree was apparently in 1847, women had been midwives up until this point for an exceptionally long time. This was considered not somehow a medical field, or at least not a medical field in the sense that, it's for women, so it's not as intricate, even though giving birth is a whole field of medicine and a whole field of surgery today. So while we didn't have a quote-unquote female physician until 1847, women had been in the medical field for much, much longer than that.